His own generals thought he had lost his mind. He had just inherited the throne of a small kingdom on the edge of Greece. He was 21 years old, surrounded by enemies, and his job, everyone agreed, was to consolidate power before he did anything bold. Instead, he marched on Thebes. Then he proposed invading the largest empire in the known world with 35,000 men. Then, when he should have struck the killing blow, he turned south and conquered Egypt instead. His soldiers thought he was reckless. His enemies thought he was easy prey. His advisors begged him to slow down. And in 331 BC, when the Persian Empire fell to him without a fight, every one of them finally understood. Alexander hadn't been making mistakes. He had invented something none of them could see. And Robert Greene calls it grand strategy. We've all met people like Alexander, even if we don't know it. The colleague who seems to be making all the wrong moves and somehow keeps getting promoted. The friend who turned down what looked like a perfect job and ended up in a better one a year later. The competitor who lets you win the small battles and then somehow walks away with everything that actually mattered. These people are not lucky. They are not winging it. They are operating on a level the rest of us cannot see, because the rest of us are busy fighting for whatever is in front of our face right now. Most of us live our lives in tactics. We react, we respond, we fight whatever fight is closest. We finish today's task, then start tomorrow's. We answer the email in front of us. We deal with the crisis on our desk. We try in the moments between to figure out what we want our lives to look like. And we mostly fail because the moment we sit down to think, the next fire breaks out. Strategists don't live this way. They sit at a higher altitude. They make decisions today based on where they want to be in 3 years. They lose battles on purpose to win wars on principle. They hold their nerve when everyone around them is panicking. And by the time their critics finally see what they've been doing, it's too late to stop it. This is part 2 of 3. In part 1, we covered the inner war. How to know your enemies, master your own mind, lead a team, choose your battles, and become someone other people stop trying to fight. Those 11 strategies are the foundation. Now we go on the offensive. Over the next 90 minutes, I'll walk you through the next 11 strategies in Robert Greene's masterpiece, The Strategies of Attack. We'll move through 4 movements. First, how to think like a general instead of a soldier. Second, how to strike where it actually counts instead of where it feels good. Third, how to break an opponent's coherence so completely they cannot recover. And fourth, how to finish what you started, because some of the worst defeats in history were won by people who didn't know how to close the deal. These are the strategies of advancement, of the considered move and the decisive blow. They are the difference between people who are merely active and people who are truly powerful. So let's begin where Alexander began. Section 1. Think like a general. The year is 336 BC. Alexander's father, King Philip II of Macedonia, has just been assassinated at his daughter's wedding. The kingdom Alexander inherits is large by Greek standards, but barely a regional power compared to Persia, Egypt, or the great Greek city-states to the south. Athens, Thebes, Sparta. Philip had spent 20 years carefully assembling a fragile alliance of these city-states called the League of Corinth. The moment his death is announced, the League starts coming apart. Thebes openly revolts. Athens prepares to break with Macedonia. The neighboring tribes to the north see weakness and start sharpening their swords. Alexander's advisors are unanimous. The new king, they say, must move slowly, consolidate the army, spend a year, maybe 2, securing his northern borders, send diplomats to Thebes and Athens to talk things through, demonstrate that he is a stable, predictable ruler, win the trust of the League before doing anything ambitious. This is sound advice. It is what his father would have done. It is what every reasonable Macedonian noble in his court is begging him to do. Alexander does the exact opposite. He marches south within weeks of taking the throne. He arrives at Thebes faster than anyone thought possible, so fast that the city has barely begun preparing for war. He destroys it. He levels the entire city, kills 6,000 of its citizens, and sells the rest into slavery. Athens, watching the smoke rise from 100 miles away, immediately begs to be readmitted to the League. Alexander accepts their apology. The other Greek cities fall in line within days. His advisors are stunned. The young king has just done something they considered impossible. He has unified the Greeks through pure terror, in a single campaign, in a fraction of the time anyone thought was needed. He is brilliant, they conclude. Now surely he will spend the next several years consolidating these gains. Instead, he tells them they're going to invade Persia. The Persian Empire at this point stretches from modern-day Turkey to the borders of India. It has a population of 50 million people. Its army outnumbers the entire Macedonian army 10 to 1. Its navy controls the eastern Mediterranean. It is by every measure the largest and most powerful state on earth. No Greek has ever conquered it. No one has even seriously tried in 150 years. Alexander's plan is to cross the Hellespont with 35,000 men and bring it down. Some of his generals openly weep. Some of them refuse to go. In 334 BC, Alexander crosses into Asia Minor. His first battle at the Granicus River goes better than anyone could have hoped. He routs the Persian forces sent to stop him. His generals, riding the wave of victory, expect him to do what every conqueror in history has done after a victory like this: march east into the heart of the empire and force the Persian king Darius into a single decisive battle. Alexander refuses. Instead, he turns south. He spends the next year liberating Greek cities along the coast of what is now Turkey. Then he zigzags east. Then he turns south again. He marches into Phoenicia and besieges the city of Tyre for 7 months. Then he goes further south, into Egypt. The Egyptians, who hate their Persian overlords, welcome him as a liberator. He is crowned pharaoh. He spends nearly a year there. Back home in Greece, his critics start whispering that the young king has lost his nerve. He has been seduced by Eastern culture. He is wearing Persian robes. He is adopting Persian customs. He is even worshipping Persian gods. The crusade has stalled. The whole expedition will end in disaster. Then, in 331 BC, Alexander finally turns east. He marches deep into the Persian Empire and meets King Darius at a place called Arbela. The two armies face each other on a vast plain. Darius has more men than Alexander has ever faced. By the end of the day, the Persian army is shattered. Darius flees the field. The empire collapses, and Alexander, at 25 years old, is the master of the known world. Now look at what just happened. Look at it again, slowly. Because almost nobody, not Alexander's own generals, not his enemies, not the historians who wrote about him for 1,000 years afterward, almost nobody, in the moment, could see what he was actually doing. Why did he attack Thebes when he should have consolidated? Because he understood, in a way no one else did, that the League of Greek cities would never be his ally as long as they thought he was weak. He couldn't wait years for them to come around. He needed to terrify them into compliance, in one stroke, so that when he turned east toward Persia, his rear was secure. Why did he refuse to chase Darius after the Granicus? Because chasing Darius would have stretched his supply lines across hundreds of miles of hostile territory, with the Persian navy free to attack his ports back home. He couldn't fight Persia and protect his rear at the same time. Why did he go south instead? Because the Persian navy operated out of ports along the coast. By taking those ports, Tyre, Sidon, the cities of Phoenicia, he was destroying the navy without ever fighting a sea battle. He was eliminating Persian sea power by walking on land. Why did he go to Egypt? Because Egypt was the breadbasket of the eastern Mediterranean. As long as Persia controlled it, they could starve any campaign Alexander tried to wage. By taking Egypt, which the locals handed over almost without a fight, He simultaneously fed his own army and starved the Persians of supplies and revenue. Every single move that looked like a mistake to his contemporaries was, in fact, a piece of a single coherent plan. A plan that operated on a scale none of them could see, because they were thinking in battles, and he was thinking in campaigns. This is what Greene calls grand strategy, and it is the first principle of going on the offensive in any meaningful way. Most people, when they want something, fight for it directly. They see the goal, they charge at it, they attack the obstacle in front of them, and when they fail, they don't understand why, because the obstacle in front of them was rarely the actual problem. The grand strategist sees something different. The grand strategist asks, what do I actually want 3 years from now? Not 3 months, 3 years, 5 years. What does the finished version of this look like? And what is the sequence of moves, the unglamorous, unobvious, sometimes seemingly counterproductive sequence of moves that will get me there? Most of those moves will not look like progress to outside observers. Some of them will look like retreat. Some of them will look like defeat. Some of them will infuriate your friends and confuse your allies and embolden your enemies. But every one of them, like Alexander's zigzag through the Mediterranean, is doing something that the people watching cannot see, until the day it all comes together and the empire falls without a fight. In your own life, this means something specific. It means stop reacting. Stop making decisions based on what's most urgent today. Stop letting other people set your agenda. Sit down, actually sit down and answer one question honestly. Where do you want to be in 3 years? Not what you're supposed to want. Not what your parents told you to want. Not what would impress people on social media. What do you, looking deep at your actual life, actually want? Once you have an answer, work backwards. What does the version of you who has that thing look like? What does that person know? What did they sacrifice? What did they refuse? What did they walk away from? What looked like a mistake to other people that turned out to be the single best move they ever made? Almost nobody does this. Almost everyone lives in tactics, finishing the next task, putting out the next fire, climbing the closest available ladder. You don't have to live that way. You can become the person whose moves don't make sense to anyone until 5 years later, when they all turn out to have been the same move. But Alexander's grand strategy worked for one reason that we haven't talked about yet. He understood the people he was up against. And the second strategy in part 2 is about what happens when you don't. The year is 1838. The British Empire is at the height of its power, and one of its senior officials in India, a man named William McNaughton, has just been put in charge of an enormous decision. The British government is worried about Russia expanding into Central Asia, threatening their hold on India from the north. The buffer state between the two empires is Afghanistan. Its current ruler, Dost Muhammad, is friendly enough to the British, but McNaughton and his colleagues fear that if the Russians offer him the right deal, he might switch sides. So McNaughton proposes what looks on paper like a clever solution. The British will invade Afghanistan, depose Dost Muhammad, and install a former ruler named Shah Shuja, a man who's been living in exile under British protection for 25 years. Shuja will be grateful. The country will be friendly to British interests. The Russians will be blocked, and everyone goes home. The plan is approved. In August of 1839, the British army marches into Kabul. The invasion is almost shockingly easy. Dost Muhammad flees into the mountains. Shah Shuja is reinstalled on the throne. McNaughton is made the senior British envoy in Kabul, and he settles in with great satisfaction. He sends letters back to London assuring everyone that the operation has been a complete success. But what McNaughton cannot see, what he refuses to see, is that almost everything he believes about the Afghans is wrong. He believes the Afghans will come to love Shah Shuja once they get used to him. They won't. They remember Shuja as a weak king who lost the throne for good reason, and they see him now as a foreign puppet. MacNighton believes the Afghans are simple, childlike people who will be impressed by the trappings of British civilization. So he brings his wife to Kabul. Other British officers bring their families. They build a comfortable cantonment outside the city. They drink wine, they hold horse races, they throw parties. What the Afghans actually see is an occupation that is making itself permanent. They see foreign men in strange uniforms drinking alcohol and riding horses past their mosques. They see foreign women walking unveiled in the streets. They see a culture that, in their eyes, is openly disrespecting everything they consider sacred. The hatred builds slowly, then rapidly. 2 years pass. The British government, alarmed at the cost of the occupation, orders MacNighton to start cutting expenses. He decides to reduce the subsidies he has been paying to the Afghan tribal chiefs to keep them quiet. The chiefs, furious, start making plans. In November of 1841, an Afghan mob storms the home of a British officer in Kabul and murders him. MacNighton is warned that this is the beginning of a coordinated uprising. He refuses to believe it. He sends letters back to London assuring his superiors that the situation is under control. He continues to host dinner parties. By December, the entire country is in revolt. The British cantonment is surrounded. Supplies are running low. MacNighton, finally panicking, agrees to a meeting with one of the Afghan leaders, a man named Akbar Khan, the son of the deposed Dost Muhammad. He believes he can negotiate his way out. He believes that all men, deep down, are reasonable and that a sufficiently generous offer will resolve the situation. At the meeting, Akbar Khan greets him cordially. They sit down on a carpet to talk, and then mid-conversation, Akbar Khan draws a pistol MacNighton gave him as a gift weeks earlier and shoots him through the chest. His body is dragged through the streets of Kabul. In the weeks that followed, the British army of 15,000 soldiers and civilians attempted to retreat from Afghanistan back to India. They were ambushed in the mountain passes by Afghan tribesmen. Of the 15,000 who started the retreat, exactly one man, a doctor named William Bryden, reached the British fort at Jalalabad alive. Everyone else was dead. Now here's the question Greene wants you to ask. How does this happen? How does the most powerful empire on earth lose an entire army in a country it was supposed to be casually controlling? Because MacNighton, like most people in most situations, never bothered to actually understand the people he was dealing with. He projected, he assumed, he looked at the Afghans and saw what he expected to see. He filtered every piece of information through his own assumptions about what reasonable people want. And when reality contradicted those assumptions, he ignored reality. This is Greene's 13th strategy. He calls it Know Your Enemy. And the principle is simple but ruthless. Almost every defeat you've ever experienced, in business, in relationships, in any kind of conflict, happened because you misread the other person. You thought they wanted what you would have wanted in their position. You thought they would respond to incentives the way you would respond. You assumed they were operating from the same logic, the same values, the same fears as you. They weren't, they never are. And the moment you started projecting your own mind onto theirs, you stopped seeing them at all. Sun Tzu's most famous line is know yourself and know your enemy, and in 100 battles you will never be in danger. Most people read that and think, yeah, sure, of course, do your research. But that's not what Sun Tzu meant. He meant something much harder. He meant get out of your own head. Look at the actual person in front of you. Read what they say. Read what they don't say. Watch what they do when they think no one is watching. Notice what they're afraid of. Notice what they want that they would never admit to wanting. Notice the small contradictions, the moments their mask slips, the things that don't fit your model of who they are. Build your strategy around them, not around the imaginary version of them you've been carrying around in your head. If you take only one thing from this section, take this. The reason most people fail in conflict is not that they're outmatched. It's that they're playing chess against an opponent they never bothered to look at. MacNighton died because he never saw an Afghan. He saw his own assumptions wearing a turban. Don't be MacNaughton. So you've thought like a general. You've studied your opponent. You've decided to move. The next question is, where exactly do you hit? Section 2. Strike where it counts. In the year 1219, on the Great Plains of Central Asia, a man named Genghis Khan was preparing for war. His enemy was a ruler named Muhammad, the Shah of Khwarezm, and Muhammad ruled what was, at that moment, probably the wealthiest empire in the world. His domain stretched from the Caspian Sea to the Hindu Kush. He had cities of stunning beauty, Samarkand, Bukhara, Urgench, places of libraries and bathhouses, and gold-domed mosques. He had 400,000 soldiers in his army. He had walls so thick that no army in living memory had broken them. He had, just a year earlier, made one mistake. A trade caravan from Genghis Khan had arrived at one of his border cities. The local governor, suspecting the merchants were spies, had killed all of them and stolen their goods. When Genghis Khan sent ambassadors to demand justice, Muhammad had executed the lead ambassador and sent the others home with their beards burned off. Muhammad was not afraid. He had 400,000 men. The Mongols, by every estimate, had less than half that. The Mongols were nomadic horsemen. They had never taken a major fortified city in their lives. Muhammad's empire was protected by mountain ranges to the south, by the wealthy walled cities of his frontier, and most importantly, by the Kizil Kum desert. The Kizil Kum was 400 miles of red sand, blistering heat, and dry death. No army in history had ever crossed it. No one even tried. Muhammad's western capital, Bukhara, sat right on the eastern edge of that desert, and Muhammad considered the desert side of his city so safe he didn't bother to fortify it. In the spring of 1220, Genghis Khan's army moved against the empire. As Muhammad expected, one Mongol force came through the mountain passes from the east, led by a general named Jebe. Jebe's force fought the Shah's army in the Fergana Valley, took some losses, and seemed to be barely holding their own. Muhammad, watching from Samarkand, became confident. The Mongols were exactly as overrated as he had thought. He concentrated his armies to the east to crush them. What Muhammad did not know was that Jebe's slow, struggling battle in the Fergana Valley was theater. It was a deliberate piece of misdirection, a slow setup designed to fix the Shah's attention forward, eastward, while something else happened. Months earlier, Genghis Khan had captured a man, a guide who had once led caravans across the Kizil Kum. There was, the guide admitted under questioning, a chain of oases hidden in the desert. Anyone who knew where they were could cross. Anyone who didn't would die. In the spring of 1220, while Jebe's force was pinning down the Shah's attention in the east, Genghis Khan personally led an army of 50,000 men into the Kizil Kum. They moved at night to avoid the heat. They drank from the hidden oases. They appeared on a clear morning in March at the gates of Bukhara, a city that had no defensive walls on the desert side because no army had ever come from that direction before. The Bukharans surrendered within days. Samarkand, the empire's eastern capital, fell within weeks. The Shah's armies in the east, suddenly cut off from their own capital, started deserting. Generals turned on him. The Shah himself fled west, then south with a handful of bodyguards. The Mongols pursued him relentlessly. He died months later on a small island in the Caspian Sea, abandoned by all of his men, wearing rags, begging fishermen for food. The wealthiest empire in the world had been gone for less than a year. Now think about how Muhammad lost. He didn't lose because the Mongols had a bigger army. They didn't. He didn't lose because the Mongols had a better technology. They didn't. He didn't lose because his own troops were cowards. They weren't. He lost because Genghis Khan understood something about speed that almost nobody before him had understood. Speed is not just movement. Speed is the difference between the time it takes you to act and the time it takes your enemy to understand what you've done. The faster you move, the longer it takes them to catch up. And once you're ahead of their understanding, they spend the rest of the battle reacting to a situation that already changed. Genghis Khan didn't just move fast. He moved in a sequence the Chinese called slow, slow, quick, quick. First, slow, meticulous preparation. He spent years scouting the empire, finding the guide who knew the desert. Second, slow, set the enemy up. Lose the first battle on purpose. Make them confident. Make them feel they understand what's happening. Third, quick, strike where they're looking. Pin their attention on the front. Fourth, quick, and now strike from somewhere they cannot believe is possible. Out of the desert, out of the dark, from the angle they didn't even bother to defend. This is the Blitzkrieg strategy, and it's named after the German tank attacks of 1940. But Genghis Khan invented it 800 years earlier. The principle is the same in any era. Most people are slow. Most organizations are slow. Most enemies, even the powerful ones, are weighed down by their own size, their own bureaucracy, their own assumptions about what's coming. They have built their defenses in the direction they expect to be attacked. They have not built them in the direction nobody attacks from. If you can get there, if you can move so fast and from such an unexpected direction that they don't even understand they're being attacked until it's already too late to respond, you can defeat people with vastly more resources than you. In your own life, this means something specific. When you decide to move on something, a project, a confrontation, an opportunity, don't telegraph it for weeks. Don't argue about it. Don't take a survey of how everyone feels. Prepare quietly, study the situation, and then, when the moment comes, act so fast and so completely that by the time anyone notices, the thing is already done. The people who would have stopped you don't stop you because they're still trying to understand what just happened. By the time they figure it out, you're already 3 moves ahead. You don't always need to be stronger. You don't always need to have more. You just need to be so much faster that the gap between when you act and when they react becomes the space where you win. But speed is not enough on its own. Sometimes you're not facing an enemy who can be surprised. Sometimes you're facing someone who refuses to engage at all. Someone passive, someone elusive, someone who controls the situation by not seeming to control anything. And for those people, you need a different weapon entirely. In a small office in Phoenix, Arizona, in the middle of the 20th century, a slight man with a soft voice and a cane was, quietly, the most influential psychiatrist in America. His name was Milton Erickson. He had been crippled by polio as a teenager, and his physical limitations had taught him to read people in a way nobody else could. He couldn't move easily. He couldn't speak loudly, so he learned to watch, to notice the smallest twitch of a muscle, the tiny hesitation before an answer, the way a patient sat in a chair when they thought no one was looking. By the time he was middle-aged, Erickson had developed a style of therapy that was, in its quiet way, devastating. People who walked into his office with problems they had been carrying for decades walked out, sometimes after a single session, with those problems gone. Other psychiatrists studied him for years and could not figure out what he was doing. One day, a man came into his office for a first appointment. The man was nervous. He started pacing the room. He couldn't sit down. He couldn't sit still. Now you cannot do hypnosis, which was Erickson's specialty, on a person who refuses to sit. The session was about to fail before it began. Erickson watched him pace for a moment. Then he said, very gently, "Are you willing to cooperate with me by continuing to pace exactly the way you're pacing now?" The man, surprised, agreed. Why not? He was going to pace anyway. Then Erickson said, "Could I tell you where to pace and how fast?" The man saw no harm in this, so Erickson started giving him directions. Walk to the window, now to the door, now slower, now turn left. After several minutes, Erickson started hesitating between directions. The man who had been pacing on his own a moment ago was now waiting for instructions. He was no longer in control of his own movement. Then Erickson said, "Sit in that chair." The man sat. Within a minute, he was in a deep hypnotic trance. Another day, A woman came to Eriksson with a problem. Her husband, she said, had a weak heart, or he claimed to have a weak heart. Doctors had repeatedly told him there was nothing wrong, but he believed a heart attack was always imminent, and he used this belief to control her. Whenever they argued, he would clutch his chest. Whenever she wanted to do something he disapproved of, he would warn her about his condition. She was exhausted, angry, and guilty all at once. Eriksson listened. Then he gave her a strange piece of advice. Continue being sympathetic to him, he said, but the next time he warns you about a heart attack, tell him politely that you understand you need to go tidy the house. Then I want you to place these brochures around the house. And he handed her a stack of pamphlets from local funeral homes. If he warns you again, sit at the kitchen table and start adding up the numbers in his life insurance policy on a calculator. The woman did exactly what Eriksson told her. The first time the husband saw a funeral brochure on the coffee table, he was furious. The second time he heard the calculator clicking through his death benefits, something in him shifted. Within 2 weeks, he stopped using his heart as a weapon. He started having normal conversations with his wife for the first time in years. He had been forced, gently but absolutely, to stop the manipulation, because the only thing more uncomfortable than threatening to die was discovering that his wife was already calmly preparing for it. This is what Greene calls the forcing strategy, and it's specifically designed for the most frustrating kind of opponent, the one who controls you through passivity. We've all dealt with these people, the colleague who never says no, but somehow your projects keep stalling, the family member who doesn't argue but always gets their way through guilt, the friend who is always tired, always overwhelmed, always the victim, and somehow you keep being the one rearranging your life around them. You can't fight these people directly. The moment you fight, you become the aggressor in their story, and they win. What Eriksson understood is that the way to break passive control is not to attack it, it's to absorb it. You enter their system, you take what they're already doing, the pacing, the chest clutching, the helplessness, and you make it work for you. You agree with them, you amplify them, you keep going further into their pattern than they're comfortable going themselves, and at some point, they hit a wall. They were using their behavior as a weapon, and now you've taken the weapon away from them by walking right into it. In your own life, the lesson is this. When you find yourself caught in a frustrating pattern with someone who never quite engages, who never quite commits, who somehow always gets their way, without ever seeming to stop pushing back, move into their pattern instead. Take it further than they're willing to take it themselves. Make their passivity their problem instead of yours. Almost every time, the dynamic breaks, sometimes immediately, sometimes after a single conversation that they remember for the rest of their lives. So you've moved fast. You've broken through passive resistance. The third strategy in this section is about a deeper question. When you do attack, where exactly should you aim? In the year 210 BC, a 24-year-old Roman general named Publius Scipio was given a command that nobody else wanted. Rome had been at war with Carthage for nearly a decade, and they were losing. The man on the other side was Hannibal Barca, the greatest military mind of the ancient world. Hannibal had crossed the Alps with elephants. Hannibal had won 3 of the largest battles in Roman history, including Cannae, where he had killed 50,000 Romans in a single afternoon. Hannibal was loose in Italy, raiding at will, and the Romans had no idea how to stop him. They had tried to engage him directly, and they had been crushed. They had tried to wear him down with hit-and-run raids, and the war just dragged on. Scipio's father, also a general, had been sent to Spain a few years earlier to attack the Carthaginian bases there. Both Scipio's father and his uncle had been killed in the campaign. Spain, where Carthage drew its silver, its troops, and its supplies, was now an open wound for Rome, and they needed someone to take command of what was left of the Spanish army. The senior generals refused. The job was a death sentence. Scipio, 24 years old, with limited combat experience, volunteered. He sailed to Spain. He took command of his father's broken army, and then he did something that should not have worked. His advisors expected him to fight a defensive war, try to hold the Ebro River, try to keep the Carthaginians from advancing further, try to wear them down. Scipio refused. Instead, in the spring of 209 BC, he marched his army 400 miles south, deep into Carthaginian-held territory, to attack a single city. The city was called New Carthage. It was the heart of the Carthaginian operation in Spain. It was where they kept their war chest. It was where they trained their reinforcements. It was where the silver mines paid out. It was the one place Hannibal's brothers, who commanded the Spanish armies, could not afford to lose. And it was, at that moment, lightly defended, because nobody, including the Carthaginians, believed any Roman commander would be insane enough to attack it. Scipio took New Carthage in a single day. He captured the silver. He captured the supply depots. He took thousands of hostages, sons of Spanish tribal chiefs that Carthage had been holding to ensure their loyalty, and freed them with a generous gesture. The Spanish tribes, who had been allied with Carthage, started defecting to Rome within weeks. Within 3 years, Scipio had driven the Carthaginians out of Spain entirely. Hannibal, still raiding in Italy, suddenly had no supplies, no reinforcements, no money coming in from the Spanish silver mines. His army in Italy began to wither. In 202 BC, Scipio sailed to North Africa, attacked Carthage itself, and forced Hannibal to come home and defend his own city. They met at the Battle of Zama. Scipio defeated him. The war was over. Rome won, and the man who had won it had never fought Hannibal directly until that final battle. He had won the war, instead, by understanding something about Hannibal that nobody else in Rome had figured out. Hannibal was not Carthage's strength. Hannibal was a brilliant general, the most brilliant general the world had ever seen, but he was just one man. The thing that made him dangerous was the structure that supported him: the silver, the Spanish bases, the reinforcements, the supply lines. Take those away, and Hannibal was just a man with a tired army stuck in the wrong country. This is what Greene calls the center of gravity, and it is, when you really sit with it, one of the most useful ideas in this entire book. Almost everyone you'll ever face in life, every problem, every opponent, every obstacle, looks more powerful than they actually are, because their power is concentrated in a single thing that's holding everything else together. Find that thing, hit it, the rest collapses. What Scipio understood was that there's a difference between attacking your enemy and attacking the source of your enemy's power. Most people in conflict attack the enemy. They go after the visible thing, the competitor's flagship product, the bully's most aggressive insult, the argument they shouted at you last week. These are surface attacks. They feel satisfying. They sometimes even win small skirmishes, but they don't change the underlying situation, because the source of the other side's power isn't the thing you're attacking. The source is somewhere quieter. It's the relationship, the reputation, the funding, the single client, the one belief about themselves that everything else rests on. Find the center of gravity. Ask yourself about whoever or whatever is in front of you. What is the one thing holding this together? What is the source? Where is the silver mine? Sometimes it's a person, the one ally without whom the whole network falls apart. Sometimes it's a belief, the one assumption your competitor has about the market that, if it turns out to be wrong, breaks their entire strategy. Sometimes it's a piece of leverage, the one thing your opponent values more than they value the fight you're in. When you find it, you have to be willing to do what Scipio did. Walk past everything else. Don't get drawn into the surface battles. Don't waste your strength on the visible enemy. March 400 miles past the front line if you have to, and aim everything you have at the one place that, when it falls, brings down the rest with it. Most fights are not won by the strongest fighter. They are won by the fighter who figured out where to hit. Hannibal was the greatest general of his age. Scipio beat him without ever fighting him, until the day Hannibal had nothing left to fight with. You don't always have to be the better warrior. You just have to be the one who saw, before anyone else did, where the whole thing was actually held up. So you've thought like a general. You've struck at the center. But there's one more problem. Sometimes the enemy you face is too large, too coordinated, too well defended for any single strike to bring it down. When that happens, you need to break them, not in one place, but in the connections between their pieces. Section 3. Break their will. In the late summer of 490 BC, on a flat strip of coast about 25 miles northeast of Athens, 10,000 Greek soldiers stood looking out at the largest invasion force they had ever seen. The Persian Empire had come to destroy them. 25,000 soldiers, twice the size of the Greek force, hundreds of warships, cavalry that the Greeks had no answer for, archers who could rain death from a distance. The Persian king Darius had sent this army with a simple personal mission: punish Athens for supporting a rebellion against him a few years earlier and burn the city to the ground. The Athenians had managed to assemble 10,000 of their citizens, farmers, craftsmen, merchants, with armor on for the first time in their lives, and marched them to Marathon, the plain where the Persians had landed. They had sent a runner to Sparta to beg for reinforcements. The Spartans had sent back word, "We will help, but our religious festival prevents us from marching for 10 more days." The Athenians did not have 10 days. They probably did not have 10 hours. Their commander, a man named Miltiades, had a problem his 10 fellow generals could not see a way around. Wait for the Spartans, and Athens fell. Attack now, and they would be slaughtered, outnumbered, outranged, with Persian cavalry waiting to ride them down. There seemed to be no good option. For days the two armies sat looking at each other across the plain. The Persians were waiting too. They were waiting because they had a plan of their own, a plan Miltiades was about to discover. On the morning of August 12th, Greek scouts spotted something strange in the Persian camp. Most of the Persian cavalry, the most dangerous part of their army, was being loaded onto ships. Sailors were rolling up tents. The fleet was preparing to leave. A few sympathetic locals managed to slip across the lines and confirm what was happening. The Persians had decided not to fight at Marathon at all. They were going to sail their cavalry around the coast to the Bay of Phaleron, just outside Athens itself. The plan was to take Athens from the sea while the Athenian army was tied down 25 miles away. The Greek army would arrive home to find their city burning. The infantry left at Marathon, about 15,000 of them, was just a holding force, designed to keep the Greeks pinned down while the real attack happened somewhere else. Miltiades looked at the situation and saw something the other Greek generals could not see. They wanted to wait. They wanted to retreat to defend Athens. They wanted most of all to wait for the Spartans. Miltiades wanted to attack right now, before the Persian fleet could finish loading. The Persians had just made a crucial mistake. They had divided their forces. The army at Marathon was no longer 25,000 strong. It was 15,000. The cavalry was on the ships. The Greeks suddenly had something close to a fair fight on their hands for a few hours, until the rest of the Persian army landed at Phaleron. If the Greeks attacked now, fast, and won fast, they could march back to Athens and arrive at the bay before the Persian ships could disembark. If they waited even one day, both halves of the Persian army would be where they could do harm. The vote among the 10 Greek generals was tied at 5-5. Miltiades broke the tie himself. They would attack at dawn. At 6 in the morning, the entire Athenian army charged across the plain at the Persian lines. The Persians, expecting a defensive battle, were stunned by the speed of the assault. Greek archers had no time to set up. Persian formations broke. By 9 in the morning, the battle was won. The Persians who had not been killed were fleeing back to their remaining ships. But the battle was not the hard part. Miltiades looked at his exhausted, bleeding soldiers, men who had been farming a week earlier, who had just fought their first battle of their lives, who had been awake since before dawn, and gave them an order that should have been impossible. "We are running to Athens right now." The Greek army marched 25 miles in their armor, in full sun, with their wounded carried on shields, in 7 hours. They reached the Bay of Phaleron in the late afternoon, just as the Persian fleet was sailing in. The Persians, expecting to disembark into an undefended city, looked toward the shore and saw the same army they had just been beaten by at Marathon, standing in formation on the beach, dust-caked, blood-streaked, ready to fight again. The Persians turned around. They sailed home. Now think about how Miltiades won. He didn't win because he had more men. He didn't win because he had better weapons. He didn't win because he had smarter generals on his staff. He won because the moment the Persians divided their force, he saw an opportunity nobody else saw, and he took it before the window closed. This is what Greene calls the divide and conquer strategy, and the principle behind it is older than military history. When you face an opponent who is bigger than you, more powerful than you, more resourced than you, you cannot beat them as a single unified force. They will roll over you. You have to find the moment, or create the moment, when their unity breaks. Every powerful enemy has joints, connections, places where one part of them depends on another part. A general depends on his cavalry, a company depends on its supply chain, an organization depends on the cooperation between two departments that secretly hate each other. A movement depends on the personal relationship between two leaders. If you can find those joints and pry them apart, the giant becomes manageable. The pieces separated are no longer dangerous. Most people, when they face something overwhelming, see one big undefeatable enemy. The grand strategist sees joints. They look for the lines of weakness, the tensions inside the structure, the relationships that, if broken, change everything. Sometimes you create the division yourself. You whisper a rumor that turns two allies against each other. You make an offer that one part of the organization can't refuse, knowing the other part will resent it. You time your move for the exact week when their attention is split between two crises. Sometimes the division happens on its own, like the Persian cavalry boarding ships at the wrong moment, and your only job is to recognize it the second it appears and act before the gap closes. Either way, the principle is the same. Don't fight the giant whole, find the seams, break it apart, then deal with the pieces one at a time. But sometimes you can't break the enemy apart. Sometimes they're already too well organized, too coordinated, too well defended on every front. When that happens, you need to do something different. You need to make them defend a place they didn't know they had to defend. In November of 1796, 26-year-old Napoleon Bonaparte was facing a crisis that should have ended his career. He had spent the previous 6 months winning a remarkable series of victories in northern Italy against the Austrian Empire. He had pushed the Austrians back, town by town, until he had trapped a large Austrian force inside the fortress of Mantua. But Napoleon's army was exhausted. His soldiers had been fighting non-stop for half a year. They were starving, ragged, sleeping in the rain, and the Austrians were not done. They had assembled a fresh army of 50,000 men, almost twice the size of Napoleon's force, and they were marching south to relieve Mantua and crush him. The commander, a baron named Joseph d'Alvinci, had studied Napoleon carefully. He knew Napoleon's tricks. He had divided his own army into 2 columns, one large, one disguised to look smaller, to attack Napoleon from 2 directions at once and trap him. By early November, d'Alvinci was closing in on Napoleon's base at the city of Verona. He had won 2 battles in a row. He had pushed Napoleon's forces back. The legend of the unbeatable young French general was about to end. The Austrians were within sight of Verona. The trap was almost shut. On the night of November 14th, Napoleon disappeared from Verona. He took most of his army and marched in secret, in the dark, southeast, away from the Austrian advance. His staff thought he had cracked. He was running. He was leaving Verona to fall. He wasn't running. He was looking at a map. And on the map, 20 miles southeast of Verona, was a small village called Arcola. And just past Arcola was the Austrian supply line, the single road by which Da Vinci's army got its food, its ammunition, and its reinforcements. The road by which, if the worst came to the worst, the Austrians could retreat home. On the morning of November 15th, Napoleon's army appeared at the bridge of Arcola, directly behind the Austrian advance. Da Vinci, who had been about to attack Verona that morning, suddenly received the most disorienting news a general can receive. There was a French army between him and home. He had to stop attacking. He had to turn around. He had to fight urgently for a bridge he had not even noticed on the map a week ago. What followed was 3 days of brutal combat at the bridge of Arcola. The Austrians defended desperately. Napoleon, leading charges in person, was nearly killed. The fighting was inconclusive, but it didn't matter that the fighting was inconclusive. The damage was already done. Da Vinci could not press his advantage at Verona, while a French army was sitting on his supply line. He had to keep men at Arcola. He had to thin out his front. He had to, for the first time in the campaign, defend instead of attack. On the third day, Napoleon sent a small detachment of cavalry around the back of the Austrian position with trumpets, making them sound like a much larger force coming up from a new direction. The Austrians, already strained, already tired, already aware that they were now the ones being surrounded, broke. They retreated east. The trap they had set for Napoleon had become a trap they themselves were caught in. Within 2 months, Mantua surrendered. The Austrian campaign in Italy collapsed. Napoleon's reputation went from rising star to legend. Now look at what Napoleon did. He didn't win the Battle of Arcola in any conventional sense. The combat itself was a stalemate. He won by making Da Vinci defend a flank he hadn't intended to defend. This is the turning strategy, and it's one of the deepest ideas in offensive warfare. Most fights happen on a front. There's a line, you're on one side, your opponent's on the other. They've prepared for you to attack across that line. They've set up their defenses for that direction. They've concentrated their attention on that point. If you attack the front, even if you win, you're attacking exactly where they're strongest. You're attacking exactly where they expect you. You're going to take heavy losses no matter what. The turning strategy says, don't attack the front. Go around it. Move so your enemy has to defend a flank they didn't know they had to defend. Make them turn. Make them spread thin. Make them divide their attention between the original front where they were strong and the new front where they have nothing prepared. The moment they turn to face your flank attack, the front itself becomes weaker, and the moment they're divided between two fronts, both fronts become defendable. In your own life, this works in ways that aren't obvious. When someone is attacking you head-on, making a public criticism, pressing you in an argument, putting pressure on you in a negotiation, your instinct is to defend the front, counter-argue, defend the criticism, negotiate harder on the same point. You will lose, or you will spend enormous energy holding even. They've prepared for the front attack. That's where they're strongest. But almost every aggressive person has a flank they have not defended. Their reputation, their relationships with people they need but don't appreciate, their dependency on something they don't realize they depend on, the thing they assumed nobody would notice. When you stop defending the front and quietly raise an issue at their flank, when you go around the argument and bring up the thing they're actually vulnerable about, the dynamic changes instantly. They have to turn. They have to defend something they didn't expect to have to defend. And while they're turning, you've already won the original argument because their attention is no longer on it. This is not about being underhanded. It's about not being naive. If you only ever attack where your enemy expects you, you are fighting the war they prepared for. If you can make them fight a war they didn't prepare for, even a small one, even a symbolic one, you take their advantage away. But there is one final strategy in this section, and it's the most extreme one in the entire book. It's not about dividing the enemy. It's not about turning their flank. It's about ending the conflict so completely that nothing of it can come back to fight you again. On the morning of January 22nd, 1879, on a plain in southern Africa called Isandlwana, 1,800 British soldiers were about to be erased from the face of the earth. The British Empire had decided that year to put an end to the Zulu kingdom. The Zulus, under their king Scipio, had built an army of 40,000 warriors, barefoot, armed mostly with spears and rawhide shields, but trained in a way no European had ever seen. They were drilled from childhood. They could march 50 miles a day. They fought in a formation called the Horns of the Buffalo, a dense central body that pinned the enemy in place, with two long horns that swept around either side to encircle them. The British commander, Lord Chelmsford, did not take any of this seriously. He was a Victorian gentleman. The Zulus, in his view, were primitive tribesmen. His soldiers had rifles, the Zulus had spears. The math, he believed, was obvious. On January 21st, Chelmsford took half of his central army and marched east, looking for the main Zulu force. He left 1,800 men camped at the foot of a strange, sphinx-shaped mountain called Isandlwana. He told them to wait there. He did not order them to dig defensive trenches. He did not order them to circle their wagons. He believed, since the Zulus seemed to be far away, that there was no immediate threat. In the morning, scouts on the plain to the north of the camp chased a few Zulu cattle herders into a ravine. When they reached the edge of the ravine, they stopped their horses just in time. Below them, packed shoulder to shoulder, stretching as far as the eye could see in both directions, sat 20,000 Zulu warriors in full war regalia. They had been hidden in that ravine for 2 days. They were, at that moment, in deep meditation, preparing themselves for battle. The scout met the eyes of the nearest Zulu warriors. They rose silently to their feet. The British camp had perhaps 15 minutes to prepare. The Zulu army, when it came over the ridge, did not look like an army at all. It looked like the earth itself was rising. 20,000 men in 3 formations, a dense center body, and 2 long sweeping horns moving around either side of the camp. They moved at a steady run, dropping into the grass, vanishing, reappearing 200 yards closer. The British formed firing lines and started shooting. They were good shots. Hundreds of Zulus fell. Hundreds more kept coming. The British commander at the camp, a colonel named Anthony Durnford, had disobeyed his orders earlier that morning and split his men into smaller units to scout the area. By the time the attack came, his forces were too dispersed. The firing lines had gaps. As the British soldiers reloaded, the rifles of 1879 took several seconds between shots. The Zulu warriors closed the distance. They started hitting the lines. The horns of the buffalo swept past the camp on both sides, met behind it, and closed. The British were now completely surrounded, 1,800 men inside a circle of 20,000 Zulus. As the ammunition ran low, men started dying in close combat. The Zulu spear made a particular sound when it went into a body and was withdrawn, a sucking, wet sound that men who survived that day remembered for the rest of their lives. By 2 in the afternoon, the British position broke. There was a small gap in the encirclement, and a few hundred soldiers tried to flee through it. Most were caught and killed within minutes. Of the 1,800 men who had been in the camp that morning, 55 survived. Everyone else was dead. The Battle of Isandlwana is one of the most complete annihilations in military history, and the reason Greene includes it in this book is not to celebrate it. It is to teach a brutal but important lesson. The Zulus did not just defeat the British that morning, they erased them. There was no British force left to retreat, regroup, fight another day. There was no battered army limping home with a story to tell. There was, where there had been an army at sunrise, almost nothing at sunset. The annihilation strategy says this: when you commit to a fight, really commit, after long thought, after you have decided this enemy must be defeated, do not leave them an exit. Do not stop halfway. Do not let them escape with 20% of their strength to come back at you next year. The half-finished victory is the most expensive kind of victory there is. It costs you everything a complete victory costs, and then it costs you again the next time the enemy returns. Stronger now, angrier now, having learned everything they learned from the first round. Now this is the strategy where you have to be careful. Greene is not telling you to be cruel. He is not telling you to destroy people. The annihilation strategy in modern life almost never involves destruction in the literal sense, but it does involve finishing what you start. It does involve not stopping at good enough. It does involve when you decide to leave a job, leaving completely. When you decide to end a relationship, ending it cleanly. When you decide to make a change in your life, making the change completely enough that the old version cannot come back to claim you again. Most of us know this from our own lives. We have all left jobs we thought we had left, only to find ourselves still entangled in them 6 months later. We have all ended relationships we thought we had ended, only to be pulled back into them at 3 in the morning. We have all started new chapters of our lives only to discover, a year later, that we never closed the previous chapter completely, and that's why the new chapter never really began. The lesson of Isandlwana, scaled down to the size of a normal human life, is simple. When you fight, fight completely. When you decide, decide all the way. When you finish, finish the thing. The half victory is the slowest, most expensive defeat there is. So you've thought like a general. You've struck where it counts. You've broken your enemy into pieces. There's only one section of this book left in part 2, and it's the section that almost everyone in real life gets wrong, because winning the fight and closing it out clean turn out to be two completely different skills. Section 4. Close the deal. In May of the year 1800, Napoleon Bonaparte was about to gamble everything he had on a single campaign in northern Italy. 6 months earlier, he had seized power in France in a bloodless coup. He was now first consul, the most powerful man in the country, but his position was fragile. The royalists wanted the monarchy back. The radicals wanted the revolution back. The army was loyal to him personally, but no one was loyal to the office he held, because the office he held was new, and France had not decided yet whether it was real. Meanwhile, Austria was preparing to invade. Their army in northern Italy, 80,000 strong under a general named Michael von Melis, was about to push west into France itself. If Napoleon could not stop them, the country he had just inherited would be invaded within weeks. If he could not win decisively, his political enemies in Paris would replace him before the year was out. He needed a victory, not a small one, a defining one. He spent days locked in his office. His secretary, a man named Bourrienne, would later remember finding Napoleon lying on giant maps spread out across the floor. Reconnaissance reports were piled on every desk. Note cards covered in Napoleon's handwriting were organized into wooden boxes, hundreds of them, each one a possible move, a possible counter-move, a possible disaster, a possible recovery. He muttered to himself for hours at a time. He was not just making a plan, he was trying to anticipate every way the plan could go wrong. At one point, he called Bourrienne over. He pointed to a small village on the Italian map. The village was called Marengo. "I will fight him here," Napoleon said. He had never been to the village. He had never seen the terrain in person, but he had calculated from the maps that this was the place where the Austrian campaign would have to break, and so he would arrange the entire campaign to bring the battle to that one specific spot. In April, the campaign began. Almost immediately, things started going wrong. Napoleon had ordered General André Massena to hold a position in Genoa to pin down the Austrians. Massena got surrounded almost immediately. He was forced to surrender weeks earlier than Napoleon had counted on. Then General Jean Moreau, who was supposed to send Napoleon a key division of reinforcements through the Alps, refused. He sent a smaller, less experienced division instead. Napoleon's careful arithmetic was already broken. He had fewer men than he had planned for. He had less time than he had planned for. The Austrians were stronger than he had planned for. Napoleon's staff watched him in those weeks, expecting him to crack. He didn't. He kept making adjustments. The smaller division Moreau had sent, Napoleon routed them through a more obscure mountain pass to confuse Austrian intelligence about how many men he actually had. Massena's surrender, Napoleon used it as bait, moving his army closer to where the Austrians were celebrating their victory, knowing they would now overcommit. Each piece of bad news, instead of breaking the plan, became another move on the chessboard. On the morning of June 14th, the Austrians attacked at Marengo, exactly where Napoleon had said they would, but they attacked earlier than he expected, and with more men than he had ready. His divisions were scattered. He was outnumbered 2-1 on the field. By 3 in the afternoon, the Austrian lines had broken through. The French were in full retreat. The battle was, by every measure, lost. In Vienna, the news of the Austrian victory was already being prepared for the morning papers, but Napoleon, riding among his retreating soldiers, was not panicking. He was watching. He noticed that the Austrians, in their pursuit, had let their formations fall apart. They were chasing the French in a disorganized rush, sure that the day was won. He noticed that his own retreat had not become a rout. Some of his divisions were still intact. He noticed on the horizon the dust trail of reinforcements, a French division under General Louis Desaix that he had dispatched earlier in the day, now arriving from the south behind the Austrian advance. At 5 in the afternoon, Napoleon turned his retreating army around. Deseix's fresh division hit the Austrian flank like a hammer. Within 2 hours, the Austrian victory had become an Austrian rout. 8,000 Austrians were killed or captured. By 9 that night, the French had taken the field. A few months later, Austria signed a peace treaty that gave France 4 years of peace, recognized Napoleon as the legitimate ruler of France, and ceded almost everything Austria had been fighting for in Italy. Marengo was the campaign that made Napoleon's regime real. Without it, his political enemies would have removed him by Christmas. With it, he became, for the next 15 years, the most powerful man in Europe. Now look at how Napoleon won. He did not win because his plan was perfect. His plan failed at almost every step. Massena surrendered too early. Moreau disobeyed orders. The Austrians attacked at the wrong time. He was outnumbered. He was nearly defeated by 3 in the afternoon. By every measure of conventional planning, the campaign was a disaster. He won because his planning had built in something almost no one else's planning had. Greene calls this the ripening strategy, but it's really a deeper idea than the name suggests. It's about how to plan in a way that survives reality. Most people, when they make a plan, make a rigid plan. They specify what should happen. They specify when. They specify how. And the moment reality deviates from the plan, the moment one assumption turns out to be wrong, the whole plan collapses, and they're left improvising in panic. Napoleon's plans were structured differently. He spent days, sometimes weeks, mapping out every possible thing that could go wrong, every contingency, every countermove the enemy might make. He didn't write one plan. He wrote 100 small overlapping plans, each one a response to a possible reality. By the time he marched, he had so thoroughly considered every possible turn the campaign could take that no surprise was actually a surprise to him. When Massena surrendered, he had already considered what to do if Massena surrendered. When Moreau refused to send reinforcements, he had already considered what to do if Moreau refused. When the Austrians attacked at 3 in the afternoon instead of 5, he had already considered what to do if they attacked early. His plan was not a plan in the usual sense. It was a tree of plans, a planning system, a way of thinking that absorbed reality instead of fighting it. And that is the difference between people who finish what they start and people who don't. The people who don't finish when something goes wrong treat the deviation from the plan as the failure of the plan. They quit. They start over. They give up. The people who do finish treat the deviation as the next move on the chessboard. They expected something to go wrong. They didn't know what would go wrong, but they knew something would. So when it does, they're not surprised. They're already 2 steps ahead. If you take one practical thing from this section, take this. The next time you commit to something important, a project, a goal, a major decision, do not just plan for what should happen. Spend serious time planning for what will go wrong. Spend an hour sitting alone, asking yourself, what are the 5 things that could derail this? What's my move if the funding falls through? What's my move if my key partner backs out? What's my move if the timing slips by 3 months? What's my move if I get sick for a week in the middle of it? You will not be able to predict every disaster, but the act of planning for disaster changes how you respond when one arrives. You stop seeing setbacks as the end of the plan. You start seeing them as part of the plan. And that almost always is the difference between the people who actually finish and the people who don't. But Napoleon's planning was about a fight that could be ended on a battlefield. There's a different kind of closing, and it happens not on the field, but in the room afterward, the room where the deal gets made. In the year 357 BC, a man named Philip of Macedon was building an empire one negotiation at a time. Macedon, when Philip became king, was a small, weak kingdom on the northern edge of Greece. The Greeks themselves, the Athenians, the Thebans, the Spartans, saw Macedonians as half-civilized barbarians. Philip's goal, which almost no one took seriously when he first said it out loud, was to unite all of Greece under his rule. He did not have the army to do this by force. Not yet. The Greek city-states, even individually, were militarily stronger than Macedon. Together, they were untouchable. So Philip did something almost no one in his position had thought to do. He decided to use diplomacy as a weapon. His first major target was a city called Amphipolis on the coast of Thrace. The Athenians wanted Amphipolis. They considered it part of their old empire, so Philip sent ambassadors to Athens. He had a proposal. He would attack Amphipolis on Athens' behalf, take it from its current rulers, and then turn it over to Athenian control. The Athenians were delighted. They signed the treaty. They withdrew their support from Amphipolis' defenders. Philip attacked. He took the city, and then he kept it. When the Athenians sent envoys to demand he hand it over as promised, Philip's envoys gave a long, polite, complicated explanation about why the situation had changed. The Athenians, faced with the choice of going to war over one city or accepting the loss, accepted the loss. A few years later, Philip moved against another Greek territory. The Athenians, alarmed, prepared for war. Philip sent ambassadors offering peace. He offered generous terms. The Athenians, exhausted, signed a treaty called the Peace of Philocrates. Within weeks of the Athenian ambassadors heading home, Philip had marched his army into the strategic pass at Thermopylae, central Greece's main north-south corridor, that the treaty had supposedly kept neutral. Challenged about this, Philip explained that he had needed to secure the pass against a temporary threat from a rival power, and that he would withdraw soon. He did withdraw, but by then his troops had been seen all over central Greece, and his influence had spread. This is how Philip moved, year after year. Treaty, advance, each negotiation a maneuver, each agreement a half-truth. Each concession he made was something he didn't actually value. Each promise he extracted was something he intended to use later, against the person he was promising it to. In 338 BC, when the Athenians and Thebans finally tried to stop him with a unified army, Philip defeated them at the Battle of Chaeronea. And then, and this is the move Greene most wants you to notice, he did not punish them. He sent his son Alexander to Athens with the ashes of the Athenian dead. He returned the Athenian prisoners without ransom. He praised Athenian culture. He convened a congress of all the Greek city-states and proposed a unified war against Persia. The Athenians, overwhelmed by his generosity, voted to make him the leader of the alliance. They erected a statue of him in their main public square. By the time Philip died 2 years later, every Greek city-state was inside an alliance he controlled. He had achieved what no Greek leader before him had been able to achieve in 300 years. He had done it almost entirely through negotiation. Now look at what Philip understood that almost no one else in his time understood. He understood that negotiation is not the opposite of war. Negotiation is war by other means. Every concession is a maneuver. Every promise is a positioning move. Every treaty is a battlefield where one side leaves stronger than the other. This is what Greene calls the diplomatic war strategy, and it is the most counterintuitive idea in this entire section. Most of us have been raised to think of negotiation as a kind of pause from conflict. We sit down at the table, we're reasonable, we make our case, the other side makes their case, we meet somewhere in the middle, both sides walk away with something. Civilization is preserved. This is not what aggressive people are doing across the table from you. Aggressive people are using the negotiation itself to advance their position. They're using the time you spend at the table to move pieces somewhere else. They're using the concessions they make to hide the concessions they're extracting from you. They're using the appearance of fairness to disguise the fact that they're winning ground you didn't even know you were defending. By the time you walk out of the negotiation feeling like you got a fair deal, they've already taken 3 things from you that you didn't notice, and they're already planning the next negotiation in which they'll take 3 more. This doesn't mean you have to become Philip. You don't have to lie. You don't have to break your word. You don't have to be cynical. But you do have to stop being naive. You have to walk into negotiations the way the other side walks in, with a clear sense of what you actually want, what you're willing to give up, and what you absolutely won't surrender no matter how friendly the conversation gets. You have to remember that the person across from you has a strategy, even if they're smiling. You have to recognize that "let's just be reasonable" is itself a tactic. It's a way of getting you to lower your defenses while their position quietly hardens. And you have to be willing, when you get up from the table, to keep watching what happens next. Because the deal you signed in the room is not the deal that gets executed in the world. The deal that gets executed is whatever the more attentive party makes of it. Negotiation is not peace. Negotiation is the part of the war where the weapons are words. If you understand that, you will stop being surprised when people you negotiated in good faith with turn out to have been moving pieces the whole time. And you will start, like Philip, to use the table itself as one of your sharpest weapons, so you can plan for disaster. You can negotiate aggressively. There is one final strategy in this book, and it is the one most people in real life never even attempt. It is the strategy of knowing how to leave. In November of 1937, a young Texan congressman named Lyndon Baines Johnson was in his first competitive race for re-election. Johnson was 29 years old. He had won his seat earlier that year in a special election, and now he had to win it again to keep it. His opponent was a serious one, a respected local politician with connections, money, and an actual record. Johnson, by contrast, had served in Congress for less than a year. He had no record to point to. He had spent most of his time in Washington learning the ropes. Johnson's first instinct was to fight an aggressive campaign, go to every town, give every speech, hold every rally. But his team's polling told him something interesting. He was already ahead, by a comfortable margin. The voters in his district liked him. Most ambitious young politicians in this position would have campaigned anyway. They would have run hard to expand the lead. They would have gone to every event. They would have, as a matter of pride, tried to win not just decisively, but overwhelmingly. Johnson did the opposite. He pulled back. He cut his appearances. He stopped giving speeches. He told his team to stop running attack ads. He took a vacation. His opponent, expecting a brutal fight, was confused. The press, expecting a brutal fight, was confused. Johnson's own staff, expecting a brutal fight, was furious. Why was he giving up his lead? On election day, Johnson won, comfortably. Not as overwhelmingly as he could have if he had campaigned full tilt, but comfortably enough. And he had spent the last 6 weeks of the campaign doing something none of his rivals understood. He had been preserving the political capital he would need for the next thing. He had refused to make enemies he didn't need to make. He had refused to spend energy he didn't need to spend. He had refused to push voters who already liked him to a level of intensity that would have, 6 months later, exhausted them. Johnson had won the election he was in by knowing how to exit it. He had banked the unspent capital, and he was going to spend it on the next race. Now, Johnson's later career, especially his disastrous handling of Vietnam, is a story Greene also tells in this book as a counterexample. The man who knew how to exit a Texas congressional race in 1937 became, 30 years later, the man who could not figure out how to exit Vietnam. Both are lessons. Both are about the same skill. The skill of knowing when something is over. This is the exit strategy, and it is, in Greene's framing, one of the most underappreciated skills in human life. Almost everyone is good at starting things. Almost everyone is decent at the middle of things. Almost nobody is good at ending things. And the reason is that ending things requires a kind of clarity most people refuse to develop. You have to be willing to look at a project, a relationship, a job, a fight, a phase of your life, and admit that it is no longer worth what it's costing you. You have to be willing to walk away from things you've already invested in, knowing that you will never recoup the investment, knowing that walking away is the cheapest option available now, even if it feels like a loss. You have to be willing to leave the table while you can still leave on your own terms, instead of waiting until reality drags you out the door. Why is this so hard? Because human beings are wired for something psychologists call sunk cost thinking. Once we've invested in something, money, time, identity, hope, we keep investing in it long past the point where it makes sense, just because we've already invested. We don't want to admit that the investment was a mistake. We don't want to face the loss. We don't want to look like the kind of person who quits. And so instead of cutting our losses cleanly, we keep doubling down until the loss we eventually take is 10 times what it would have been if we had just walked away when we should have. The strategist sees this differently. The strategist treats every commitment as something that can be ended, not casually, but cleanly. The strategist asks, even at the start of a project, what does the exit look like? What's my plan if this doesn't work? What's the trigger that tells me to stop? What's the dignified, well-timed way out? The way that preserves my reputation, my relationships, my resources, my ability to do something else. If you walk into every commitment with the exit already mapped, 2 things happen. First, you make better decisions during the commitment because you're not desperately trying to justify it after the fact. Second, when the exit moment comes, you take it. You don't drag things out. You don't pour another 5 years into something that should have ended 2 years ago. You don't, like Johnson in Vietnam, throw 50,000 more lives into a war that everyone already knows is lost. Most things in life don't end because they were finished. They end because someone finally had the courage to end them. Be the person who ends things on time. Be the person who walks away while the walking away is still your decision. You will save yourself, over the course of your life, more pain and more wasted energy than almost any other strategic skill in this book. So that is part 2, 11 strategies for going on the offensive. Let's bring them together. We've watched a 21-year-old king conquer the largest empire in the world by zigzagging in directions his own generals thought were insane. We've watched a British envoy in Afghanistan get himself and 15,000 of his people killed because he never bothered to understand the people he was occupying. We've watched the Mongols cross an impossible desert to take a city nobody thought they could reach. We've watched a quiet psychiatrist in Phoenix break his patients' control patterns by walking into them instead of fighting them. We've watched a 24-year-old Roman general defeat the greatest military mind of the ancient world without ever fighting him directly by attacking the silver mines 600 miles away. We've watched 10,000 Greek farmers run 25 miles in their armor to save a city. We've watched Napoleon turn a near defeat into a legend by attacking a flank his enemy hadn't defended. We've watched a Zulu army erase a British force completely from the face of the earth. We've watched Napoleon win at Marengo by planning for every possible disaster. We've watched Philip of Macedon conquer Greece with words instead of swords. And we've watched a young politician win his seat by knowing exactly when to stop campaigning. What does it all add up to? 5 things. First, most people live in tactics. The strategist lives in campaigns. If you only ever react to what's directly in front of you, you will be controlled by whoever is putting things in front of you. The grand strategist sits at a higher altitude. They make decisions today based on where they want to be in 3 years, in 5 years, in 20 years. They sometimes look like they're losing because they're taking moves that don't pay off until much later. They are willing to be misunderstood for as long as it takes the plan to reveal itself. If you take only one thing from this entire video, take this. Stop reacting, sit down, decide what you actually want 3 years from now. Then live the next 3 years like Alexander, making moves nobody understands until the day they do. Second, most defeats happen because you misread the other side. McNaughton died in Kabul because he looked at the Afghans and saw what he wanted to see. Almost every conflict you've ever lost in your life happened because you assumed the other person wanted what you would have wanted, feared what you would have feared, would respond the way you would have responded. They didn't. They never do. Build your strategy around the actual person across from you. Watch what they do. Notice what they don't say. Get your own assumptions out of your way and look at them clearly as someone whose mind operates differently from yours. You don't need to be more powerful than your opponent to beat them. You need to see them more clearly than they see themselves. Third, when you strike, strike at the source. Most people in conflict attack the surface, the visible behavior, the most recent insult, the thing in front of them. The strategist looks below the surface for the load-bearing piece, the silver mine, the relationship, the assumption, the single thing holding the rest together. When you find the center of gravity, you don't have to win every battle. You only have to win the one battle that, when you win it, makes all the other battles unnecessary. You are not always going to be the strongest person in the room. You can almost always be the most accurate. Fourth, when you commit to a fight, commit completely. Half victories are slow defeats. The job you halfway quit, the relationship you halfway ended, the change you halfway made, all of them are leaks in your life that drain energy for years. When you decide something is over, end it cleanly. When you decide to fight, fight to the conclusion. When you decide to leave, leave completely. The thing that comes back at you in 5 years is almost always the thing you didn't finish off the first time. If a decision is worth making, it is worth making all the way. And fifth, almost nobody knows how to leave. Be the person who does. Most people in your life, in your career, in your circles, most of them are still in fights they should have ended years ago, still in jobs they should have left, still in projects that should have been finished, still in relationships that should have been closed clean. They are bleeding energy into things that will never pay them back. Be different. Be the person who walks into every commitment knowing what the exit looks like. Be the person who knows the difference between investing more and throwing good money after bad. Be the person who ends things on time, on their own terms, with their reputation intact and their resources preserved for the next thing. You will live a very different life from the people around you. You will, by the end, have done more because you will have wasted less. Those are the 5 lessons of part 2. Think in campaigns, not battles. See your opponent as they are, not as you imagine them. Strike at the center of gravity, finish what you start, and know how to leave. These 11 strategies are the offensive arts. They are how you stop being a person life happens to and start being a person who happens to life. They are how you take what you learned in part 1 about your own mind, your own enemies, your own discipline, and start applying it outward into the world. If you have built the foundation correctly, these strategies make you formidable. They make you the person at the table that other people start being a little nervous about. They make you the person whose moves don't quite make sense to anyone until later when they all do. But here is what I want you to remember about part 2 as you carry it with you. These strategies are bright. They are clean. They are about advancing toward goals you have chosen, against opponents you have identified, in fights you have decided to fight. The book has one section left, and it is dark. Part 3 of the 33 strategies of war covers the strategies people use when they are not interested in fair fights, the strategies of misdirection, the strategies of moral high ground used as a weapon, the strategies of secret war, quiet, indirect, conducted while smiling at you across a dinner table, the strategies of passive aggression, of negotiation as manipulation, of terror as a tool. These are not strategies most of us would ever use, but they are the strategies being used on you every day by people you have not yet learned to recognize. In part 3, we don't learn how to attack. We learn how to see attacks that don't look like attacks and how to defend ourselves against the most dangerous opponents most of us will ever face, the ones who never declare war, but are at war with us anyway. If this video was useful to you, if any of these 11 strategies hit something real in your life, Robert Greene's The 33 Strategies of War is one of the most underrated books I've ever read. The full book is on Amazon and Audible, and links are in the description. If you want the foundation that everything we covered today rests on, part 1 is on the channel, the strategies of inner war, of mastering your own mind, of choosing your battles before you fight them. Part 3 is coming. Subscribe and stick around. Until then, think in campaigns. See your opponents clearly. And when you decide to move, move all the way. I'll see you in the next one.